I think I'm slowly thinking that perhaps truth is impossible to achieve, or maybe there is no truth. I think I'm getting more and more pessimistic on this ground. I'm wondering, what's your stance on truth?
I think the pessimism about truth is so interesting, because this is what epistemologist called Alvin Plantinga wrote. It's like, well, without this fundamental kind of properly basic belief idea, is that you can't actually figure out truth at all. It's not that there is no truth, because I think there has to be some truth, and it depends how you define truth, of course. But it's really the idea that, well, unless we set some definitions for truth and certain boundaries to our knowledge, then truth is unknowable or unjustifiable, in the sense that it's just our belief in our senses, for example, are not rationally justified, because that's circular. Like, there's some certain assumptions and presuppositions that you need to accept a priori in order for you to get to truth. Without those a priori understandings of the world or of our cognitive faculties, we wouldn't know about truth. So there's this disconnect which can only be bridged almost by faith. And I think that this is what Descartes was getting in his meditations. He was like, well, what is the only thing I know is the perfect being, which is God. And then from that, he gets kind of the perfect being, the ontological, not the ontological a la Anselm, but the ontological a la innate ideas and perfect images, that kind of ontological argument. Mm-hmm. He gets to God, and it's like, well, I think Descartes touched on something very important, is that unless we have some assumption like God, or assume that God exists, and God has created our mind such that it produces truth, and we know that, there is no way for us to truly reach truth as a conclusion. And there's something very, very big here as a problem, which I think is very, very difficult to overcome.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what in analytic philosophy they would call like the problem with foundationalism. Well, I really fucking hate analytic philosophy. But anyways, foundationalism is the idea that the only way to justify knowledge is that you have certain axioms that you start with, and then you can slowly build up through deduction. And the problem is exactly what you were talking about. That, well, how exactly can you justify all the fucking axioms if you need the axioms to start justifying things? And for Descartes, for example, there's a very famous accusation that he's going in a circle because he's got the epistemic principle, or the principle for generating knowledge, called clear and distinct ideas. He's like, well, everything I perceive clear and distinctly would lead to true knowledge. And then he justifies his clear and distinct ideas through the existence of a benevolent God. But then he proves the existence of a benevolent God with clear and distinct fucking ideas. So I think that's a problem with every single attempt to justify truth or justify knowledge, because you'll forever end up in a circle.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and I think that's very interesting. It's like, because I think, and that not only goes to knowledge, I think it goes to anything surrounding the human faculties. It also goes to kind of skepticism and stuff like that. It's like, well, to what extent can we actually realize the truth, or to what extent can we understand the world around us? It will always fundamentally be circular. We can't escape this, and that's why I think, while foundationalism is not very, or this idea is not a very satisfying view, perhaps it is perhaps the only view that you can take. Otherwise, you just have absolutely no hope, because at some point, for example, it's like, you're talking about questions, right? You make an argument, you make an argument, and you're like, why? And you're like the kid who's like so bloody annoying, like the 3-year-old kid when you say, well, it's like, why? The sky is blue. Why? Because there's some light refractions. Why? Well, because the sun's there. Why? Well, because some subatomic particles are decomposing or decaying in the sun to create nuclear energy. Why? Well, I don't bloody give a... you could ask every single thing why an infinite amount of times and never get to the bottom, and have a horrible justification for every single belief we have. And the same goes for asking why or how do we know that. You just don't, it doesn't function on that way. That's why we need axioms. And I think that's why it is a very good argument for belief in God as a tool and as an instrumental kind of view. There's a view like instrumentalism used by Isaac Newton and stuff like that. It's developed since its first foundation, but it's kind of the idea that these unknown forces should be seen as tools, even though they don't reflect that in reality. And I think that using the same idea could help with like justifying a belief in God methodologically instead of ontologically. And that's something quite interesting. And I wouldn't say that that's the best way to believe in God. I think there are other arguments, but I do think that might be something quite interesting to look at, because we just have such a horrible field of epistemology, and there's such a massive gap that we cannot fill without some sense of axiom or foundation.
Well, I guess my problem with the kind of axiomatic approach is exactly that it stops us from asking why. It gives you a stop to the why, and I think it deprives human beings of some very fundamental part of themselves. As well as there's also the other case of once you have the axioms down, then if you cannot question them, the system can become ossified and it'll become corrupt. So I think this is a great danger. And I find it very funny when you ask the why, because I'm that kid who always asks fucking why every single time to annoy other people. But also in Lacanian psychology, psychoanalysis, there's the idea of the hysteric. As like the hysteric is the person who asks always why. Why am I who you tell me who I am? Why is the world structured like this? Why do we have to do this? And there is this asking of the why that is the most disruptive, but also the most constructive way of proceeding. And my problem with this axiomatic approach is that it stops the why.
Well, I think that's a very funny thing. I think we see ourselves on two sides of the spectrum here. I think my view is more that if you ask why all your life, you would be an epistemological nightmare and you would not be able to ground absolutely anything. Like it's a position which, while intellectually viable, is not existentially satisfying. It's impossible to live that out in some degree, if you see what I mean. And it's this inability to live it out which I find great issue with, because like we've recognized that if you constantly ask why, if there is no axioms, no ultimate thing that you're going to get to, and you're just going to ask why for infinity, and you'll never get to the bottom of anything, and that's impossible to live.
No, I think that's a perfectly good way to live, and I would argue that it's perhaps the best way to live. Because I think where I differ from you is that this constant asking of why, always trying to get down to think through something again and again and again, although it's epistemologically frightening. There's also another side where I think that's where philosophy really begun and thinking really begun. It is this asking of why and not accepting any single axiom. Well, Aristotle said philosophy began with wonder. What exactly does wonder mean? Wonder is exactly this asking of why towards what seems so ordinary. And I would argue that you don't necessarily have to arrive at a firm foundation in order to live properly. You can. The most satisfying thing is exactly trying to constantly ask this why, to have this constant wander towards the world through this why, and try to dig deeper and deeper and deeper, not necessarily because you believe that you will arrive at a firm foundation, but because this exploration is intrinsically valuable.
I think you're touching on a very good point here, but I would like to clarify a few things first. And it's not like I'm saying that we should not accept why. I think we should be asking why. I think it is very helpful. I'm just saying that it's impossible for us to truly live out just constantly asking why, because we would never be able to do anything. It's like the person who's trying to calculate. It's kind of like the classic argument against utilitarianism, especially like calculated utilitarianism. Like, how the hell are you going to do the utilitarian calculus? It's impossible. Like, what are you going to do? Just constantly calculate every single probability of every single thing you're going to affect? No, because the more you know, the more you're going to have to add to that calculus. And before you could even pick up the pen, or before you could even pick up your phone, you have like a million different calculations you have to do in order to justify morally picking up the phone, right? So, I mean, there's this kind of idea that if you're constantly asking why, you just never even get off to do anything. For example, if I ask you right now, before you even open the Zoom call. It's not a Zoom call, it's a StreamYard call or whatever. But it's like, if I ask you, why are you doing this? Or like, why does the phone exist? And then you'd probably say, it's made in the factory. Well, why does the factory exist? Well, it was created by people. Why do people exist? Well, they evolved. Why did evolution exist? Well, because there's natural selection. Why did natural selection exist? Well, because of the way how people survival of the fittest. Why does survival of the fittest exist? You see, you could keep on asking this for infinity, and you'll never get to a certain conclusion. And us doing absolutely anything in your life, I think, without accepting some fundamental level of justification, you just have to ask why forever, and you'll never get anywhere, and your life will be completely useless. Because for every single thing you want to do, for every truth statement or possible truth proposition that you're interacting with, even to the degree of me existing in front of you, it would be completely unjustifiable, and you'll be asking why forever, and you wouldn't be able to live.
Yes, I take your point. I think somehow you have to try to. I want to have my cake and eat it too, in the sense that first, well, of course, I want to live on with my ordinary life without sort of, I guess, paralyzed by whatever why questions, but also I want to reserve the right to ask all these whys, to tackle all of these fundamental axioms, because I really believe in Hegel that everything that's already described have its contradictions involved. So there's no end in history, but instead it's always open. And the same for knowledge. Knowledge is always open. There's no certain knowledge. You can always dig deeper and deeper and deeper. But at the same time, one has to find some way to ground oneself in some belief system or some axioms from which one can act.
I would like to say your application to existentialism here is very beautiful. You've become almost a neo-Sartrean with your usage of truth here, I suppose, to some degree, though you've become that which you hate. You've metamorphosized, you've stared into the abyss, and the abyss has taken you. But I do think that there's just something, and this is a fundamental Nietzschean idea, that if you can't live out a philosophy, does that not represent the fact that you ultimately psychologically don't find it convincing enough? Because it's all well and good to say, well, let's keep our life and then just experiment with this philosophy thing. But then, well, if you can't even, what's the point of this philosophy thing if you can't even add it to your life? There's this counter kind of argument, is that the only way, the true justification, or the true way to view philosophy, and this is what I take from Nietzsche, and I think it's so profound, it's like, the true way to figure out whether someone's philosophy is correct or not, or at least the first thing you should ask is, are they living it out? Are they trying to realize it in their lives? If not, then there's probably something wrong with it. And this is not really a philosophical position a la the analytic philosophies, but I think because analytics, they honestly don't care about how the hell you live your life. And I think that's why I hate so much about the analytic philosophy. It's like, you could have someone like analytically believing that, like, imagine they got to some conclusion that drinking alcohol is wrong, and then like the next day you're like talking, and then you're like going partying with your friends, right? You're a uni student, and then the teacher was just like analytically convincing you that drinking is wrong. It's like has like 6 vodka shots in front of him in the bar, and you're like, what the hell is going on here? That's completely something about analytic philosophy. The Nietzschean would say, well, that's bloody stupid. It's like, you better you practice what you preach, because philosophy is the will to power. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's like, philosophy is the ultimate will to power. The will to truth is the will to power. It's like, you combine the truth with the will to power, and you combine your life. You should see them together, and if they're separate, there's probably something that you've gotten wrong along the way.
I guess I have 2 things to say here, but I have forgotten what's the first thing that I wanted to say after everything that you said. But yeah. Oh, okay. One thing is that I don't want to say that philosophy is necessarily a will to truth. I think a philosophy to a quote unquote will to truth is exactly a bad philosophy, because I think the fundamental drive of philosophy is to see whether what we believe is true is false. and then see what's slightly better than that, and then try to peel off and peel off and peel off again and again and again. And I think this is livable in two ways. Firstly, you can't separate, and I agree with you, philosophy from life, but instead, I think that the action of doing philosophy, of participating in this wonder, of questioning what I used to believe, questioning why, is a fundamental part of one's life. And I don't see a big separation there, why it's unlivable in that sense. But in another sense, the sort of the questioning that I want to propose, I guess, is not a questioning of just, well, I'm sitting in my study every single fucking day and just writing and reading, but also it's a dialectic between me thinking, me doing something inside the world, and then thinking about my own actions, thinking about what I've acted upon, and then trying to revise it in some way, and then apply those. I don't like the word axiom, because I don't think any structure can be justified in an axiomatic way. But I can use this new understanding of the world that I've gained through contemplating on my own action to go into the world and act again, and then come back and contemplate on that and ask why again. So the asking of the why has to be complemented with this implementing of this new understanding that I've gained in order for me to question again and again and again.
But I think we're talking about perhaps two sets of questionings here, perhaps. Mm-hmm. You're more talking about beliefs, but I think I was talking more about more of a fundamental level about how do we trust our cognitive faculties in that. And I think that fundamentally, if you're, and I'm not saying that we're, and that's why I try to say presupposition instead of axiom at the beginning. It was like, well, these things are not necessarily axioms, because I'm not saying we could posit everything into a neat set of axioms, a la the piano axiom or something like that, right? Rather, I'm trying to suggest that there are certain areas, and this is why it's properly basic beliefs, is that you can't get any further than that. And it's the idea that, well, it's like our cognitive faculties. You have to trust them, otherwise you can't live. And if you ask why so much about your cognitive faculties, it is a paralyzing belief, perhaps, because you'll never go forward from that. And I think why should be asked about your other things, like your morality or your other kind of facets of philosophy, right? But at the same time, those aren't the foundational beliefs you get about what is reality, because once you understand your cognitive faculties and have a decent understanding of rationality, then you can build upon that complex theories of philosophy, which are strong and unshaken. But the foundation is not there. I think that we have a very big problem at hand. And that is kind of where I'm saying is that it's unlivable, because it's not because it's unlivable to question why about these other things. If you're questioning why about the cognitive faculties, you'll never get anywhere else.
I would agree with you to some extent, but I still think, firstly, what do you mean by proper basic beliefs? Because I think there are some that we take as completely basic that we can question. For example, the law of non-contradiction. But other than that, it seems like it would be the end of philosophy or the end of thinking if we take everything as, well, this is just a proper basic belief. That's just a proper basic belief. Well, I want you to clarify, what kind of properly basic beliefs are you talking about? Can you give some examples? Or what are all the properly basic beliefs that you think we have to believe or have to accept?
Well, I wasn't. I think we don't. I think the thing with properly basic beliefs is that it's not a finite set of things that you like. It's not like a kind of thing where you say, what are the properly basic beliefs? These are the things. I think there exist properly basic beliefs which we do not yet know about because we haven't gone that far in our thinking. And there are also things which are foundational or fundamental to belief in the world around us. And as a result, I take a bit more of an instrumentalist view about it, in the sense that, well, for example, trusting our cognitive faculties is fundamentally unjustifiable. You get to an area where it's ultimately circular to justify it. But at the same time, it's absolutely vital to know anything else. And as a result, properly basic beliefs are such which both are somewhat circular in their foundation, like kind of asking, well, why should we trust our senses is ultimately a circular question. And that which is in question is absolutely fundamental to know the world around us, or understand truth, or reach anywhere else, or reach any sort of knowledge. But then put that aside, and I think this is one of the reasons why I think the theistic hypothesis, or at least I really like the theistic hypothesis, is that, of course, there's arguments for God and stuff, but not only do they help you existentially, theologically, psychologically, and all those other forms, they also help you epistemologically as well. Like all this problem, all this vaguity over what is truth and whether it's accessible disappears on the theistic hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Without the theistic hypothesis, you have to ask questions about them. And I completely agree with you that it's important to ask questions about our beliefs, whether truth is knowable. And there's, of course, there's this set of things which you constantly have to ask why about, and you will never get to the depth to. But I think that action is just so inaccessible that it's a very almost, you get to this point where it's almost absurd to even try to accept such a proposition that we can't trust our cognitive faculties, or truth is unknowable. And yeah, it's kind of like that, and we can build upon that, I guess.
So, no, because your description of properly basic beliefs is really puzzling. Because in some sense, it seems like you're not disagreeing with me at all. You're just saying, well, there may be properly basic beliefs, but we don't know anything about them, so we should think about them and question them and really see what is properly basic. And we may not get to an end of it at all. So, I think would you accept this characterization?
Well, I think you would get to an end of it. I think not knowing about something doesn't mean we don't know what it, like, not knowing about it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist yet, or it isn't applicable yet, because I think the properly basic belief arises when we reach the situation of the two situations I discussed. It's like, well, is the foundation fundamentally unknowable? And number two, is it fundamentally necessary or foundationally necessary for belief? We might not know all the properly basic beliefs right now, but it's not like we're on a search for properly basic beliefs either. It's only when you get to a field where you're like epistemology, where you're like, well, we're kind of screwed here. We don't know the truth. We cannot reach the truth on this understanding because it's fundamentally circular. We can't trust our cognitive faculties because it's fundamentally circular again. We cannot trust anything because there's these problems, and as a result, there is a need for a properly basic belief in that situation. So it's different from like constantly questioning further and further and further, like someone saying cognitive faculties, why? It's like, well, no, it's not why. There's a properly basic belief, or that is necessary for our understanding of other things as well, which that is at the foundation of our cognitive faculties. So
can I take you in a Kantian sense? So all the properly basic beliefs would be what he calls sort of the forms of intuition, the fundamental concepts, the schemas, as in like things that are synthetic but a priori, the possibilities for us to experience anything. Would that be what you call properly basic belief?
I think that's quite close to it, and I don't think we need to go into the details of like the differences and stuff like that. But I think it's quite close, and it is quite easy. It's one of the better ways to like characterize or look at it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what should be our epistemological stance towards properly basic belief? Should we try to find all the properly basic belief, or?
I don't think we should at all. I don't think it's necessary, because like I think properly basic belief only comes in when you reach a certain dilemma or a certain problem, and that's when the properly basic belief comes in. It's not something where you just go around and like you expect a solution and you're like, well, what exactly should we do here? Let's look for more properly basic beliefs, because you don't really know the properly basic belief unless you first found the problem. Like unless you first realize that there's something fundamentally circular and unknowable, but is also at the same time absolutely vital. Unless you could figure out situations which arrive at those two scenarios, then there is no need for a properly basic belief to be found. Like it's like kind of, what's the point in finding all the guns in USA? Now the anti-gun people would be quite annoyed at me, but like, what's the point in finding all the guns in the USA as long as you get all the guns from the people who might shoot someone, right? Like, yes, there's always going to be guns everywhere, right? Scattered around the place. But as long as you could find, and I'm not saying this is practically possible, but then of course we're talking about epistemology, so it doesn't really matter at this point. I thank the analytic philosophers for this, but But essentially, you can get all the guns, right? You get all the guns that you need, and you're like, well, yes, there are other guns out there, but then they're not doing any harm. For example, the gun which is like found at the bottom of the lake, like who the hell is going to like swim to the bottom of the lake to get the gun? Like, there's no point in searching there for the gun. Maybe there is a gun there, but whatever, right? Like, this is like kind of the same approach to properly basic beliefs, I suppose.
But don't you think, well, at least from how I'm seeing it, it is itself, you acquire something whenever you identify a properly basic belief. I almost don't want to say that once you identify a properly basic belief, you have to say, okay, I have to believe in it. It is more like an identification of, well, this is what I will believe, no matter whether I like it or not, so long as I live inside this world and act within it and think within it. And it itself is I feel like it itself is a form of positive knowledge to identify these properly basic beliefs.
I think it's a very difficult thing though with properly basic beliefs. And I think that's one of the problems. But at the same time, I don't see any way around it because I don't see any situation where we just constantly keep on asking why about the cognitive faculties. I find it completely pointless. So it's kind of like this kind of instrumentalist view that I'm holding right now. It's more pragmatic view. But then, of course, I don't necessarily need to hold a properly basic belief because our cognitive faculties are justified by a God. So, I mean, I think for me, it's perhaps a bit easier. I'm just talking about it as assuming that you don't believe in God. Like, what's the best other hypothesis? I think the best other hypothesis, apart from believing in God, is indeed this kind of situation where you're not believing in God and you just have these properly basic beliefs to justify belief.
Yeah, would a belief in God be a properly basic belief, or
it wouldn't be a properly basic belief because it's justified by other things as well. Because I mean, if you were saying, well, God exists in kind of the circular Descartesian way, then you might say it's a properly basic belief. I think to some degree, not necessarily, because you could view it as an inductive argument, kind of like, well, why on earth do we have this idea of the infinite consciousness or perfection? And that could only come from God. I mean, that's a possible way to look at it without looking at it as a properly basic belief. But then I think there are other arguments for the existence of God, like your cosmological arguments, like your whatever arguments, historical arguments, like whatever, right? Like those things justify belief in God, which aren't based on kind of like immediately a circular belief. Though you could say they are fundamentally circular because the only way you can know the truth about those arguments is via cognitive faculties. And then as a result, it's God. And then you have a circle there. Though I do think that if that's the case, then I think all our beliefs are fundamentally circular because we'll always have a circular reasoning at our ultimate cognitive faculty level. So, I mean, it doesn't help. I think it doesn't help anything if we just assume that the circularity at the cognitive level is circular and view that as any way to defeat any argument, because otherwise all our arguments are defeated immediately, if you see what I mean. Like there's this fundamental problem at beginning, which will always have a circular understanding as far as we go. It's just dependent on like, well, which is less circular? It's clearly, I think it's less circular if we view the God hypothesis, arguing for the existence of God, and then using God to justify cognitive faculties, then saying, well, the cognitive faculties just justify themselves to some degree, and then build any argument from that. I think the God hypothesis is less circular because, at least on one sense, you can, assuming that our cognitive faculty, because then you could formulate some ideas saying, or at least some working principle, and now you might accuse me of axiomization, but you could say, well, let's assume for the sake of debate, and I think we all do this, that our cognitive faculties are reliable. Like they might not be, but at least when we start discussing things, we both have the assumption that they are. Like when we discuss things together, we both assume that our cognitive faculties are reliable. If not, then what's the point of us discussing together, right? Like what are we even doing here? So as a result, there's kind of this pre-assumption that there is indeed this discussion, and then we can build upon that with our other theories.
Okay, I guess I have two responses. First, from looking at like this, it seems like there's only one form of properly basic belief, and it's the belief that your questioning is actually worthwhile because, for example, your cognitive faculties are reliable, etc., etc. So I don't see how you can extend the notion into anything else. And that's my first question. The second question is, I feel like you're falling into analytic bullshit by saying like the God hypothesis, etc. Because I don't think belief should function in that way, or in this hypothetical way, at least in believing in things like God. It should be, and I'm following Kierkegaard here, a kind of leap in faith, a complete belief from which God is retroactively justified because you already believe in God.
Well, I agree with that approach about God, but at the same time, I'm using the God hypothesis in the analytic way because I think what we're dealing with here is a very analytic problem. And I think it's just easier to talk about it as the God hypothesis than anything else, because that's just the easiest, the most practical way to talk about it in our current discussion, in our current setting. So that's kind of like the second objection. But about your first objection is that, well, I mean, I'm completely fine if I accept the idea that there's only properly basic beliefs based on our epistemology and our knowledge. Like, that's definitely possible to me as well. I mean, I'm open to the existence of other properly basic beliefs, but at the same time, I don't see their need to be used anywhere else. Like, that's fine as well. So yeah, that's kind of my response to two objections.
So then I don't really see the utility of this notion then. It's so limited in this sense. Although of course it's important, but what it's trying to say is that, well, whenever we try to question, we have to believe that the question is worthwhile, and that's it.
I don't necessarily think that's well. I think questioning is worthwhile, definitely, but at the same time, it's like, well, I think the acceptance of properly basic beliefs is the simultaneous acceptance of the limits of knowledge, or the limits of us knowing things from a purely analytical way. It's like if you look at everything from an analytical way, asking justifications for everything, you're never going to get anywhere. It's like it's recognition of the insufficiency of these traditional modes of philosophy, and saying, well, in order for us to progress, we must first start off at some fundamental presupposition. I think that's a very reasonable way to look at things, because otherwise you just go on and end this circle not only forward but backwards as well. Because in order to argue forwards about reality, you're also asking why backwards about your cognitive faculties, and you wouldn't even be able to get forwards because your backwards cycling just goes on forever without that properly basic belief to stop it. And that's kind of why I say the properly basic belief is important. It's that stopper to the ultimate infinite regress to the past.
But, well, I guess my take is that it seems almost a bit like Russell's solution to the paradox, as in you're sort of classifying like two different kinds of propositions, and you can't be self-referential, but except for self-referentiality. Well, I guess I'm trying to get clear whether properly basic belief is limited in this self-referential case, or whether there's other cases from which it applies.
Well, I think the difficulty here is that we don't really understand, or at least I have to admit that I'm not a very key or a knowledgeable person about epistemology. As a result, my understanding of properly basic beliefs is very rudimentary. But however, I have to say that I think that the properly basic beliefs that we're primarily concerned here is our epistemological kind of properly basic belief about our cognitive faculties. I don't think we necessarily know, or at least I don't necessarily know, about any other forms of properly basic beliefs that well. And as a result, I wouldn't say much about them. But I think for now, if we're just looking at the cognitive faculties, I think that there's no problem with it. And I don't think there's any self-referential kind of occurrence going on right here. It's just kind of saying we need an end to kind of our ability to understand and our questioning of why when it comes to our trusting of our cognitive faculties. And I think we could easily convince you that you also are living by this properly basic belief. It's like, well, when you're writing philosophy, have you ever discussed, well, are my senses deceiving me? It's like,
no, I'm not questioning this belief. I'm just saying I'm questioning the utility of like the notion of properly basic belief if it's limited in this one fucking case. Why should we talk?
But the fact that we talk about this? Yeah. But the fact that we're using it so much suggests that it is very useful. Like we're only using it in one case, but it is very useful. It's like you only use a nuclear bomb in blowing up cities, but it is very useful. You only use it in one way, but it is a very useful way to do stuff.